The cold wind of late autumn howled across the barren plains like a starving wolf, searching for prey, dragging dust and dried leaves past the weathered wooden homes that stood scattered across the lonely Wyoming frontier, where hunger and hope often shared the same table. In a small, crumbling cabin near the edge of a dying cottonwood grove lived Alara Whitlock, a young widow no more than 27, though sorrow had carved lines into her face that made her look older than the hills. Her once strong husband, Thomas Whitlock, had died 6 months earlier from fever and a fall from a skittish horse while trying to bring back feed from town. Since then, the world had shown no mercy. The crops failed under drought. The chickens were taken by foxes. The last cow lay dead by the dry creek bed, ribs sharp against her hide. Alara's children? Ruth, only 8, and Samuel, just 5, sat quiet most days now, not from obedience but from hunger too deep to even cry about. Their cheeks were hollow, hair tangled, eyes too big for their small faces. Every morning Alara rose before sunrise, hoping to find something, anything, to feed them, searching the creek for fish too small to be caught, clipping what little dandelion greens grew between rocks just to boil them into water and call it soup. But yesterday, Samuel fainted while trying to gather firewood. Today, Ruth coughed blood into a torn handkerchief. Alara had nothing left to give but her tears, and even those were growing scarce. That morning, frost glazed the corners of the cabin windows, and the wind slipped through the cracks between the logs like a whisper of death. Alara stood by the small wooden table, her knees weak, her hands trembling, as she looked at the 2 pieces of stale cornbread left from 3 days ago. They were too hard to chew, too small to share, yet she placed them gently in front of her children with a tired smile. "Eat slow," she whispered, voice cracking. She herself had not eaten in 2 days. Her dress, once a deep green, now hung from her shoulders like tattered curtains, and her boots were held together with string and prayer. She stared at the door, her mind heavy with the decision she'd fought for weeks. There was only one person within 50 miles who had the power to save her. Children from death, Cassian Hayes, the richest rancher in the Wyoming Territory, owner of the sprawling Silverhorn Ranch, a man feared by some, respected by many. He had a heart rumored to be made of stone, yet others swore they'd seen a glimmer of kindness behind his cold steel-gray eyes. Alara had never spoken more than a polite greeting to him at the general store in town, but she had seen him ride through the settlement, tall and straight in the saddle, his dark coat billowing behind him, his hat pulled low against the sun, his presence as commanding as the mountains that loomed in the distance. It was said he owned over 2,000 acres of land, 500 horses and more cattle than a man could. His ranch hands followed him with loyalty, and his word carried more weight than the sheriff's badge. But he was not known for charity, and Alara feared approaching him more than she feared death. Yet every time she looked at her children's thinning faces, the decision became clearer. That morning, as Ruth and Samuel nibbled at the dry crumbs, Alara tied her faded shawl around her shoulders, kissed each of their foreheads, and whispered, "Mama will be back before sundown. Be brave." Ruth's eyes, glassy with hunger and worry, searched her mother's face. "Where are you going, Mama?" she asked. Alara hesitated, pain splintering through her chest, but she forced a smile. "To find help." Alara stepped out into the cold morning, the ground hard beneath her worn boots, frost crunching under every step as though the earth itself winced with each footfall. The sky was iron gray, heavy with clouds that threatened snow, and the air tasted of bitter wind and loneliness. She pulled her shawl tighter, though it did little against the cold, and began the long walk toward our Silverhorn Ranch, nearly 15 miles across open land, across brittle grasslands and old wagon tracks, past silent homesteads, where smoke no longer rose from chimneys because there was no more wood left to burn. Her breath came out in small clouds, and her steps were slow but determined. Every mile felt like a confession. She had failed her husband's legacy, failed the promise she made by his deathbed to keep their children safe. But pride could not fill their stomachs, and she had learned that dignity was a luxury hunger could not afford. As she walked, her mind replayed memories of better days. Thomas laughing as he lifted Samuel to sit on the back of a horse for the first time. Ruth chasing fireflies in the summer twilight with ribbons in her hair. The scent of fresh bread cooling on the windowsill. The warmth of a fire crackling in the hearth. Those days felt like they belonged to another lifetime, another world where love and hope still lived. Now only wind and sorrow kept her company. Hours passed. The wind grew fiercer, needling through her clothes until her skin burned and went numb. Her feet ached, blistered, then went silent with cold. By midday, she could see the distant smoke rising from the chimneys of Silverhorn Ranch. Rows of fencing stretched across the land like ribs of some ancient beast, and beyond them stood wide barns painted deep red, corrals filled with horses, and workers moving like dark specks against the snow-dusted land. The main ranch house rose above it all, large, built of timber and stone, proud against the backdrop of purple mountains. She stopped for a moment, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and desperation. What would she say? Would he listen? Would he turn her away before she could even speak? She swallowed hard, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone was listening to, and forced her feet to move again as she approached the outer fence. A ranch hand, a tall, broad man with a thick coat, scarf, and hat stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "You lost, ma'am?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Ilara's lips trembled as she shook her head. I need to speak to Mr. Hayes." The ranch hand frowned. "Mr. Hayes doesn't take visitors without reason." She met his eyes, and whatever he saw in them, pain, hunger, determination, made him pause. He nodded once, then motioned for her to follow. They crossed the yard, past stacked hay bales and horses pawing at the cold ground, past ranch hands mending fences and saddling horses. Some glanced at her with curiosity, some with pity, and others with indifference. She felt every stare like a needle against her skin, but kept her head high, even as tears stung her eyes. The ranch hand led her to the steps of the big house, then disappeared inside to fetch his boss. Ilara stood alone on the porch, her aching hands clasped in front of her, her heart beating like a drum in her chest. Minutes passed like hours. Then the door opened. Cassian Hayes stepped into the doorway, tall and sharp-featured, his dark hair touched with frost at the edges, coat unbuttoned just enough to reveal the fine vest beneath. His eyes, gray like winter skies, rested on her, unreadable. "You asked for me," he said, voice low, steady. Ilara tried to speak, but her throat tightened. She lowered her gaze, breath shaking. "Mr. Hayes, forgive me for coming without invitation." He said nothing, waiting. She lifted her eyes to his, desperation raw and unhidden. "My name is Ilara Whitlock. My husband, Thomas Whitlock. He died 6 months ago." Cassian's eyes flickered. Her husband's name was known in these parts. "I remember," he murmured. Ilara swallowed, tears welling. "My children. Ruth and Samuel. They are starving. I have nothing left. No crops, no livestock. I can't." Her voice broke. She covered her mouth, shoulders trembling. Cassian stayed silent, lips pressed into a thin line, but his gaze did not leave hers. Finally, with tears spilling down her cheeks, she whispered the words that tore at her soul. "Please, take my children, feed them, save them. They are good, kind. They don't deserve to die because of my failure." Her voice cracked as she added, barely audible, "Take them, even if you don't take me." The wind went still, as if the world itself held its breath. Cassian's expression changed, though subtly. Something softened in his eyes. He took a step closer, studying her, this frail woman standing against the storm, offering up her heart to save her children. "You walked all this way to give your children away?" he asked quietly. Ilara nodded, shame and grief wrapped around her like chains. "If it means they'll live," she whispered. Silence stretched between them. Then, to her shock, Cassian said in a low, steady voice, "I'll take them. But I'll take you too." Ilara's breath caught. She stared at him, confused, trembling. "What?" Cassian's jaw tightened. "I won't separate a mother from her children. If they come to my ranch, you come with them." Ilara fell to her knees, overwhelmed, tears pouring freely now, tears of relief, disbelief, hope. Cassian reached out a gloved hand to her. "Stand," he said softly. "This land is no place for begging." She placed her freezing hand in his, and he helped her to her feet. Ilara stood there trembling, her hand still resting in Cassian's gloved palm, her mind struggling to understand whether she was dreaming or if God had finally heard her desperate prayers. His hand was warm and steady despite the cold wind, and for a moment she forgot how to breathe. Cassian let her hand go gently, as though she were something delicate that might break if touched too roughly. His eyes, still hard as forged steel on the surface, held a quiet storm of thoughts behind them. He turned slightly and motioned to one of the ranch hands lingering nearby. "Saddle a horse and prepare a wagon," he said firmly. We're riding to the Whitlock place." The ranch hand gave a quick nod, glancing curiously at Alara before hurrying off. Alara blinked, stunned. You're coming?" she asked in a hushed voice. Cassian looked at her with a calm she couldn't understand. "You walked here alone. I won't make your children do the same." His words were simple, but they struck her heart like a church bell in the quiet dawn. No one had spoken for her or protected her in a long time. She opened her mouth to thank him, to speak any of the hundreds of words tangled inside her, but none came. Cassian adjusted his hat and stepped down from the porch. "Come inside," he said over his shoulder. "You need food before we ride. You're not helping anyone if you fall from hunger." Alara hesitated at the doorway of the grand ranch house, boots leaving faint marks of mud and frost on the polished wood of the porch. The door remained open, warm light spilling out like molten honey, inviting yet unfamiliar. She stepped inside slowly, heart pounding. The interior smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread, of leather and pine. A large stone fireplace crackled in the main room, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Mounted antlers, polished rifles, and portraits of stern-looking ancestors adorned the walls, reminding her she was standing in the house of power, of a man who had built his life from discipline and decisions that weighed heavier than bullets. Cassian nodded to a middle-aged woman with braided gray-streaked hair and a calm, stern face. Mrs. Maribel Foster, the housekeeper. "Give her bread and broth," he said. Mrs. Foster gave Alara a long look, somewhere between suspicion and compassion, then guided her to sit at a sturdy wooden table. Moments later, a steaming bowl of broth and a thick slice of bread were set before her. The aroma hit Alara like something holy. Her hands shook as she broke the bread, and tears blurred her vision as she brought it to her lips. She whispered, "Thank you. Thank you." Though she wasn't sure if she spoke to the housekeeper, to God, or to Cassian. Cassian stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching her, not with judgment, but like a man trying to measure the weight of a story he hadn't yet heard entirely. "Eat," he said quietly, slowly. "You're not used to food," Alara obeyed. Each bite both relief and pain as her empty body struggled to welcome nourishment. After a few moments, when her hands stopped shaking, Cassian spoke again. "How far is your home from here?" Alara wiped her lips with the back of her hand. 7 miles east, past the creek and the dead cottonwoods." Cassian nodded. He remained silent for a while, as though sifting through his own memories. Then he said, "Your husband once helped one of my ranch hands. Pulled him out of a freezing river last winter when his horse slipped on the ice. He saved the man's life." Alara looked up sharply, surprised. Thomas had never told her. Cassian continued, "I don't forget debts." Alara's throat tightened. "I didn't come for a debt to be repaid," she said softly. "I came because I had no other choice. I would rather die than see my children." Her voice cracked again. Cassian didn't let her finish. "You won't have to," he said, firm as stone. Soon after, the sound of hooves and wagon wheels echoed outside. Mrs. Foster wrapped a woolen cloak around Alara's shoulders before she stepped back into the cold. Outside, a sturdy horse stood saddled for Cassian, and a small wagon with thick blankets had been prepared for her journey back. Cassian mounted his horse with practiced ease. Alara climbed into the wagon, her body weary yet fueled by a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in months. As they rode out of Silverhorn Ranch, ranch hands paused to watch, whispers drifting in the frosty air. Some wondered why their master was riding out with a half-starved widow in his wagon. Others said nothing, for they trusted their boss's decisions like they trusted the rising of the sun. The wind pressed against them as they traveled, biting and cold, but not as cold as the despair Alara had faced before. Snowflakes began to drift lazily from the sky, settling on the horse's mane, on Cassian's dark coat, on the edges of Alara's shawl. The land stretched, around them in shades of gray and white, bare trees like skeletal fingers, reaching toward the sky. Distant mountains shadowed in mist, the creek frozen in a winding silver line across the plains. Cassian rode ahead slightly, back straight, rein steady in his gloved hands. Alara watched him silently, her thoughts a tangled storm. Who was this man who spoke little but acted with such quiet force? Why would a wealthy rancher trouble himself with a widow and her starving children? She didn't know whether to fear him or trust him. But every time she thought of Ruth and Samuel, waiting in that cold cabin with nothing but threadbare blankets and the last of their hope, Her heart beat faster, urging the wagon forward. After nearly 2 hours, the twisted shapes of the dead cottonwoods came into view, marking the edge of her land. Beyond them, smoke no longer rose from the chimney of her home. A shiver of fear passed through her. "Please, God, let them be alive," she whispered into the wind. The wagon creaked softly as it rolled over the frozen ground, the ranch horse's breath rising in small clouds of steam against the biting air. Alara's pulse thundered in her ears as the familiar outline of her cabin appeared through the thinning trees, small, weather-beaten, smokeless and silent. Her heart clenched with fear. The windows were fogged with frost from the inside, and no movement could be seen. She didn't wait for the wagon to fully stop. As soon as it slowed near the broken fence post, she clambered down, her weak legs nearly giving out beneath her. "Ruth! Samuel!" she cried, her voice cracking like thin ice. She stumbled toward the door, snow crunching beneath her boots. Cassian dismounted smoothly, tying his horse to the fence before following, his long strides catching up to her just as she threw open the cabin door. The interior was still and frigid. The fire had burned out to cold ash. She saw them, curled up together under a worn quilt on the floor near the hearth. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Then Samuel stirred, lifting his frail head, his voice barely a whisper. "Mama?" Alara fell to her knees, sobbing in relief as she gathered both children into her arms. Ruth blinked awake, her eyes hollow but alive. "You came back," she whispered. Alara pressed her forehead against theirs, tears streaming freely. "I told you I'd always come back." Cassian stood silently by the door, his expression unreadable, his eyes lingering on the children's thin faces, the room's stark emptiness, the coldness of a home forgotten by mercy. Samuel looked past his mother at the tall stranger, confused but too weak to speak. Ruth clutched at Alara's dress. "Mama, is he here to take us away?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alara brushed Ruth's hair gently. "He's here to help us," she whispered. "We're leaving this place." Cassian stepped forward, his boots thudding quietly on the wooden planks. He knelt beside them, a rare softness flickering in his steel-gray eyes. He pulled from beneath his coat a small cloth bundle, still warm. Inside were 2 pieces of bread and a small jar of preserved peaches. Ruth's eyes widened. Samuel reached out hesitantly. Cassian handed the bread to them gently. "Eat," he said simply. They ate with shaking hands. It had been so long since their bodies knew kindness. Alara watched them, silent gratitude filling her chest like fire in winter. Cassian stood and looked around the cabin again, taking in the broken chair, the cracked window, the empty cupboards. "Gather what you need," he said quietly. "We leave in 10 minutes. Alara nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She gently helped her children up, wrapping Ruth in her shawl and Samuel in a patched blanket. They moved slowly, collecting only what mattered: a faded Bible, a wooden horse Thomas had carved for Samuel, a locket with her wedding photo, and a quilt stitched by her mother. Outside, the sky had grown paler, snow falling more steadily. Cassian helped carry a small trunk to the wagon, his gloved hands steady and efficient. Ruth clung to Alara, still unsure, while Samuel stared with round eyes at the big horse, Silver, who stood patiently waiting beside the reins. Alara lifted Samuel into the wagon and guided Ruth beside him, tucking blankets tightly around them. Before climbing in herself, she turned to face the cabin one last time. The door hung slightly ajar, and the wind rustled the bare branches of the cottonwoods like whispered farewells. It was a place full of memories, some beautiful, some unbearable. She whispered a quiet goodbye, more to Thomas's spirit than the rotting wood and stone. Cassian watched her with a gaze that didn't intrude but didn't ignore either. When she finally climbed into the wagon, he mounted his horse and clicked the reins. The wagon creaked forward, pulling away from the only home she had ever known. As snowflakes drifted gently around them, the journey back to Silverhorn Ranch was slower this time. The children, wrapped in blankets, leaned against their mother, drifting between sleep and waking, their small hands clutching hers. Alara watched Cassian riding ahead, steady, silent, a dark figure against the white horizon, and wondered who he truly was beneath that stoic exterior. Few men would have done what he did today. Few men had such power, and fewer still used it to lift the fallen. As the mountains grew closer and the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the world in shades of silver and blue, Alara felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not certainty, not safety, but hope. a fragile, flickering hope she had not dared feel since before Thomas died. By the time the wagon wheels rolled past the outer fence of Silverhorn Ranch, smoke was curling from the chimneys, and the warm glow of lanterns lit the windows. The scent of roasting meat and fresh bread drifted through the cold evening air. Cassian dismounted and strode to the wagon. He extended a hand to Alara once more. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. His fingers were warm and steady as he helped her down, then lifted Samuel into his arms with surprising gentleness, carrying the boy toward the house. Ruth followed close, clutching her mother's skirt. Ranch hands paused in their work, eyes widening at the sight. Cassian Hayes, the iron-hearted rancher, carrying a starving child in his arms like something precious. Mrs. Foster hurried out, shock written across her face, but quickly replaced by determination as she beckoned them inside. "Get them to the fire," she ordered. "And heat water for baths. These babies are frozen." The large hearth in the main hall burned bright, and as Alara, Ruth, and Samuel stepped into its warmth, the frost began to melt from their hair, their clothes, and maybe from their hearts. For the first time in months, Alara felt heat soak into her skin, felt the weight of constant fear begin to ease. Samuel fell asleep against her shoulder. Ruth sat silently, her eyes fixed on the flames. Cassian stood nearby, his hat in his hands now, his gaze flickering between the children and the window darkening with night. Alara looked up at him, lips trembling, words caught in her throat. Finally she whispered, "Thank you for everything." Cassian's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them, an understanding of pain, of loss, of promises silently made. He only said, "Rest now. You're safe here." But in his tone was a vow she could feel in her bones. She nodded, clutching her children close as the fire crackled. Outside, the wind wailed across the plains, but inside, for the first time in a long time, there was warmth, there was life, and somewhere deep within the walls of Silverhorn Ranch, destiny had quietly taken its place. If this chapter touched your heart, don't forget to support this journey. Hit the subscribe button, give a like, and ring the bell icon so you don't miss the next chapter of this emotional Western tale. Your support gives us the strength to keep bringing you more powerful stories like this. Thank you for being here. Now saddle up because the story has only just begun.